Friends of Islam, this time the Islamic faith is back before you to share Islamic information. I hope it inspires your activities today, and don't forget to click the subscribe button and activate the bell button notifications so you don't miss the latest news from the Islamic Faith channel. In the modern era that upholds science and logic, a group of Western archaeological scientists conducted a cross-country expedition to research the phenomenon of the bodies of religious scholars who were reported to remain intact even though they had been buried for centuries. Initially departing with high skepticism, they intended to prove that the news was just a religious myth or historical fraud. However, the facts they found actually shook their scientific beliefs. What really happened? The morning sunlight swept across the desert sand runway as the small plane landed at the airport in the old city of Jericho, Palestine. The dry desert wind greeted the steps of the scientists who got off the plane one by one. They came from various backgrounds: archaeologists, forensic experts, anthropologists, and historians of various faiths. However, they had one thing in common: a thirst for answers to a phenomenon that is too often considered a myth. The bodies of religious figures who remained intact even though they had been buried for centuries. The expedition team came from the University of Leipzig, Germany, an old institution known for its strict approach to science and logic. The project itself is entitled Sacred Remains, a comparative study of religious burial phenomena, and is funded by a European cross-country research institution. The initial idea was simple: to test the claims of the integrity of the bodies of religious figures spread across various regions, with the aim of comparing the biological and archaeological conditions between the three major religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Dr. Heinrich Falker, a senior archaeologist and team leader, looked at the horizon with a deep gaze. He was almost 60, but his scientific spirit had never faded. "We are not here to prove or disprove beliefs," he said in an initial briefing at the expedition camp. "We just look for data and let it speak." They started the expedition from the West Bank, a location believed to contain the tombs of holy figures from all three religions. The first location targeted was an ancient cemetery complex outside the city of Hebron, believed to be the resting place of prophets. But access to it was not easy. In addition to strict government and military permits, there was also high religious sensitivity, so they started from a more open site. The tomb of an Orthodox Christian figure who died in the 12th century is in the ruins of a Buddhist church that was recently discovered by local researchers. The excavation process was carried out very carefully. Layers of soil were removed, and the documentation team recorded every finding in notes and videos. The coffin that was found turned out to be in a state of severe damage, and when opened, only fragile bone remains were found. As expected, the body had completely rotted, leaving a dry and partially destroyed bone structure. There are indications that this decomposition process was natural. There were no preservatives, no mummification techniques, explained Dr. Elizabeth Mayer, a forensic expert on the team. In accordance with modern theory about the decomposition of the body. But this statement actually raised hopes that a comparison with bodies from other religions would provide a clear contrast. The second location was the tomb of a famous Jewish rabbi in Svet, in northern Israel. With special permission from the local government, they were allowed to scan the site without direct excavation. The results were also not surprising. The soil structure and local temperature showed ideal conditions for natural decomposition. Underground radar equipment showed only traces of bones inside the tomb. After the first two observations, everything went according to their expectations: logical, rational, and in accordance with scientific predictions. But everything changed when the team moved to the third location, a small village in southern Syria, where a great 10th century scholar named Sheikh Umar al-Faruqi was said to be buried. The tomb has long been a pilgrimage site for local people, but has never been scientifically studied because it is considered sacred. However, thanks to cooperation with local authorities and universities, the team was allowed to make limited observations. When they first approached the tomb, the atmosphere felt different, not because of mysticism or belief, but because of the faint fragrance that emerged from the ground. Something unusual about the burial site: The team used a tiny endoscopic camera to look inside the tomb without opening it. The tiny lens was inserted through a carefully opened slit, and the resulting images silenced the control room. The body in the tomb appeared intact. Her skin was tan but elastic. Her face was still clearly visible, as if she had just fallen asleep. Her white robe still wrapped her body well without any tears or decay. There was no preservative. There was no sign of embalming. There was no scientific explanation that could be directly drawn from the visuals. "Heinrich," Elizabeth said softly. Her voice was heavy. If this was really a 10th century body, then it made no biological sense. The entire team was confused. On the one hand, they wanted to stick to the data. On the other hand, this fact challenged the entire foundation of the theory of body decomposition that they had believed in so far. In the discussion room, various speculations began to emerge. Were there local microbiological factors that had not been detected? Was the body really from the 10th century, or was it a historical misidentification? However, local residents swore with full confidence, stating the genealogy and long history of the tomb's existence. Even some ancient writings stored in the village mosque recorded visits by other great scholars to the tomb hundreds of years ago. That night, amidst the cold desert temperatures and the silence of our tent, several team members began to speak in a different tone. No longer just data, but deeper questions arose. Can everything be explained by logic alone? Dr. Heinrich sat pensively in front of his monitor screen. He replayed the endoscopic recording of Sheikh Umar's body. In his heart, a small voice began to ask, could there be something more than science? Something he had never admitted in his entire life as a scientist. Their journey had just begun, but this first step had shaken the foundations they had believed to be unshakable. Their world was slowly changing, not by theory, but by a reality they could not deny. That day, the Syrian sky covered the earth with a gray color. The desert wind carried fine dust that danced in the air. As if welcoming the steps of the researchers who began to enter the tomb area, Sheikh Umar al-Farqi. An old tomb made of large stones that had been decorated with moss, and time stood gracefully in the middle of the barren field. At first glance, the tomb was no different from other ancient burial buildings in the area. However, there was something that felt odd, something that hung in the air like a secret waiting to be discovered. Dr. Heinrich Falker stood in front of the tomb door that had just been opened by a team of local archaeologists. His sharp eyes traced every carving and crack in the stone wall. Several Arabic letters were neatly placed above the entrance, carved in a Kufic style that showed medieval heritage. And under the shelter of the tarpaulin, the temperature and humidity monitors worked non-stop to measure every possibility that could explain the miracle they were looking for. "We're not going to touch anything today," Heinrich said in a deep voice. "Let's observe first. The cameras and sensors must go in first. We must make sure that this is not a pseudo-miracle." With sophisticated equipment, they lowered a small endoscopic camera through a narrow gap in the side of the tomb. A long cable dangled to the monitor screen in the observation tent. All eyes were on the screen. Instantly, the image inside the tomb slowly emerged. A small light at the end of the camera focused on the narrow rocky space. Then a figure appeared in view. The body lay still, wrapped in a white robe that looked intact even though its color had faded. His face looked peaceful, with a thin beard and thick eyebrows. His skin was dark reddish like living flesh. There was no decay, no protruding bones, not even the severe damage that is usually found in bodies hundreds of years old. But what made everyone freeze was not the appearance of the body, but the smell. Yes, a faint fragrance that slipped out with the air from inside the tomb. "This scent is not the scent of preservatives," muttered Elizabeth Mayer, who was standing with noses almost pressed against the air sensors. It was like a natural musk. No one spoke for a few minutes, just the sound of the monitoring equipment and the wind blowing from outside the tent. One of the technicians, a young Englishman named Reuben, whispered, "This can't be. A 12th century body should be disfigured." Heinrich took a deep breath. "We need carbon testing, identity confirmation, and an examination of the soil around the grave. But if this is the cleric in question and his body is not decomposing, then we may be witnessing the greatest biological anomaly of the century." The next days were spent collecting soil and air samples and studying historical records. It turns out that the name of Sheikh Umar al-Faruqi is indeed recorded in ancient manuscripts as a highly respected scholar of Islamic jurisprudence and hadith expert. He lived in asceticism, teaching and writing until he died at the age of 63. The local community has guarded his tomb for centuries. However, no one has ever dared to dismantle it. The forensic team conducted tests on soil and air particles in the tomb. The results were confusing. No chemical preservative compounds were found. There were no embalming materials, and the level of decomposing microbes around the body was far below normal, even lower than the standard for sterile laboratory soil. This does not comply with the second law of thermodynamics, said one of the scientists in a bitter voice. Organic matter should decompose over a certain period of time. This does not make sense. However, the strangeness did not end. In recording the temperature inside the tomb for more than a week, the device detected that the temperature of the tomb chamber never exceeded 20 degrees Celsius, even when the outside temperature reached 37 degrees. A phenomenon that could not be explained because there was no ventilation system, let alone natural cooling equipment there. On the fifth night, Heinrich sat alone in his tent. In his hand was a digital photo of the Sheikh's face, staring deeply. There was peace radiating from the image, something that could not be explained by formulas and data. He tried to turn back all the theories he had learned since college: molecular biology, microorganisms, organic conservation, all were dead ends. The body remained intact not because of external factors, but because of something that modern science had not yet understood. We have witnessed something that cannot be explained not because it is illogical, but because our logic has not reached it, he wrote in his personal journal that night. Meanwhile, several team members began to experience small changes in attitude. Those who were previously cold and skeptical began to be quieter, more reflective. Among them, Ruben was even seen carrying a small copy of the Quran that he got from a resident village. He didn't talk much, but that night he was seen reading silently by lantern light. In the morning, the locals brought food and sat with the researchers. An old man in a white robe and a calm smile said softly in Arabic, translated by their guide, "Allah guards whom He wills. The saints who live in truth sometimes guard their bodies." No one responded directly, but the words stuck far beyond statistical analysis or laboratory test graphs. Because in the end, there was something in the integrity of the body that touched not only the intellectual side, but also the spiritual. Their mission was no longer the same. What was originally considered scientific research had now become a journey that disturbed their old beliefs, not because of weak evidence, but because the evidence was too strong to ignore. The mystery of the body that did not rot did not only confuse their reason, it began to whisper other truths that had been covered by the fog of scientific arrogance. That morning, the main tent of the expedition team was again filled with the sound of the ticking clock, the clinking of equipment, scanners, and the sound of heated discussions. Since the discovery of the body of Sheikh Umar al-Faruqi, which was intact and gave off a fragrant aroma, the atmosphere of the team had changed drastically. No longer just working with professional spirit, they now carry a greater burden, answering the question that cannot be postponed. Is this really a miracle? Dr. Heinrich Volker stands in front of a makeshift whiteboard, writing down all the possible explanations for this phenomenon. He writes down one by one the soil composition, microclimate temperature, the influence of organic matter, and the potential presence of natural preservatives from desert plants that may be mixed in the soil. We must not jump to religious conclusions, he emphasizes, trying to keep the team's reasoning on the scientific track. Science does not reject miracles. It only demands evidence and reasons that can be tested. Dr. Elizabeth Meir, who has been the calmest so far, begins to explain the results of the carbon test. We have tested soil samples and fabric fibers from the grave in 3 different laboratories. The carbon results show that the body is indeed more than 8 centuries old. There is no doubt about that. What about the decomposing microbes? Asked Ruben, the technician who is starting to get more involved in the discussion. There are almost none. The soil composition is dry but not sterile. That is what is strange. Usually dry soil still contains decomposing bacteria, especially for that long. But here the microorganisms are inactive, Elizabeth explained while showing a graph of microbial activity that was almost flat. Heinrich added, "We have also checked for the possibility of the presence of resin or antibacterial substances. The results were zero. There are no compounds whatsoever that indicate that this body was preserved in a traditional or modern way." The team then turned their attention to another, more extreme possibility: historical fraud. Could this body not belong to Sheikh Umar, but rather the body of someone from the modern era who was deliberately buried there to build a myth? Unfortunately, that hypothesis quickly collapsed. Local manuscripts that have been studied and validated by independent historians show that this tomb has been known and respected for more than 7 centuries. Records of visits by scholars, poetry from Sheikh Umar's students, and testimonies from 13th century Islamic explorers support the authenticity of this tomb. Not only that, even in the early 19th century, a French Orientalist once mentioned the fragrant aroma emanating from the tomb in his travel notes. Such a deception could not have survived for hundreds of years, especially in a local society that continues to preserve its history in great detail, said Dr. Henry Leve, a French historian who was part of the team. One by one, the carefully constructed scientific theories began to crumble. None could satisfactorily explain why the body was still intact. Even the computer simulations they had run using data on humidity, temperature, and the chemical composition of the soil concluded that decomposition should have occurred at its maximum after 100 years. The fact that the body had remained intact for more than 8 centuries was too great an anomaly to ignore. At night, the large tent was deserted. The scientists chose to be alone, sitting in a corner of the tent or standing staring into the dark desert. There were no more long conversations. Some of them began to question not only this discovery, but the foundation of their personal beliefs. For years, they had lived with the belief that everything could be solved through logic, through formulas, through data analysis. But now they were faced with something that could not be calculated or defined. Reuben walked slowly toward the tomb. He did not enter, just stood a few meters from the stone door. In his hand was a small Quran that had been given to him by the locals. His eyes stared at the night sky filled with stars, and for the first time in his life, he whispered in a language he did not yet speak fluently, "Show me if this is true." The next morning, Dr. Heinrich stared at his messy notes. The lines of theory were crossed out, replaced, then crossed out again. He wrote a sentence in the corner of the paper that was still blank. "Maybe there is another dimension of truth that cannot be touched, science, but that doesn't mean it is not real." The next discussion in the tent was no longer as stiff as before. Some began to ask, if this is not an ordinary biological phenomenon, then what does it mean? A researcher from Sweden, who is usually skeptical, began to openly say that maybe the world is not ready to accept that some miracles are real, not because it violates science, but because science is not yet sufficient to explain it. No official conclusion was announced, but in each heart, the seeds of belief began to grow. Some began to study Islam privately, not to judge. But to understand, they began to see that perhaps in the submission and sanctity lived by scholars like Sheikh Umar, there was something much stronger than the laws of nature. A truth guarded not only by the land, but by the will of God. This chapter does not close with answers, but rather with new, deeper, and more honest questions. Could this not be just a failed hypothesis? Could it be that for the first time in their lives, these scientists had touched something truly sacred? The North African sky greeted the team with a stretch of heat radiating from the sandy soil and red rocks. They now arrived in a remote area in southern Algeria, where an ancient city called by locals as Madinat al-Maut, the city of the dead, lay silent in the middle of the desert. This city was once a center of knowledge and spirituality, a gathering place for scholars and students from all over the Islamic world. Now all that remains are the ruins of buildings, the ruins of mosques, and old tombs that are silent in the midst of time. Their goal is clear: to excavate and research the tomb. Sheikh Idris al-Kabir, a great saint who lived in the 11th century. He is known not only as a fighter who fought against early colonialism in the North African region, but also as a jurist whose writings are still studied today by students in Morocco and Tunisia. Historical records state that his tomb is still guarded by a small group of descendants of his students. Although the area is no longer permanently inhabited, when they arrived, a group of old men greeted them without much talk, only with smiles, calm, and questioning looks. One of them, who introduced himself as Sayyid Murtada, gave permission to open the tomb on the condition that they must be physically clean and not have any intention of degrading honor. The intimate guardian agreed. They washed their hands and faces in a small spring that still flowed in a crack in the rock, and then wore sterile clothes as usual. But there was a different nuance in their steps this time, more careful and more respectful. Sheikh Idris's tomb is located in a small stone building, surrounded by thorny bushes and old date palms that look like natural guards. The tomb door is made of teak wood that has blackened with age. When opened, the air inside immediately attacked. However, it was not a foul or musty smell, but a clean and light aroma. Like wet soil that had just been watered by rain, the lights were turned on, the camera was pointed, and once again all eyes were fixed. The body of Sheikh Idris lay in a stone hole covered with a wall carpet. His face still looked intact. Even the thick emerald green robe he was wearing had not been damaged, only slightly faded in color. His fingers were still holding prayer beads. Old wood that looked like it had been made yesterday. There were no signs of decay, no tissue damage. Only extraordinary calm radiated from his facial features, as if he was sleeping in very deep peace. Dr. Elizabeth Meir held her breath and whispered to Heinrich, "We are witnessing this again." Heinrich just nodded slowly. There was no more room for denial or argument. This was the second case that was impossible to explain by the biological laws that they understood. They took samples very carefully, a pinch of soil from around the body, a little fiber, the cloth of the robe, and air from inside the tomb. Each step was taken with reverence and caution. Meanwhile, on the other side of the dead city, a second team was examining the tomb of a Christian bishop who had lived in the area around the same time. According to history, he was also an important figure among his people and widely respected during his lifetime. But when his tomb was opened, all that was found was an old, nearly disintegrated skeleton, scattered bones, and scraps of cloth that had rotted to dust. These two data were collected and carefully compared. The soil composition was nearly identical, with only a slight difference in humidity levels. The temperatures at the two locations showed no significant difference, but the results were like two unrelated worlds. One body was completely destroyed, and the other remained intact, as if untouched by time. "We can't close our eyes anymore," Henry Lee Fever said in a low voice as they regrouped. That night in the main tent. This was not a matter of science failing to explain, but of something beyond our scope of knowledge. No one responded with theories or debates. The silence spoke volumes. In their hearts, each began to accept that what they were facing was not a scientific coincidence. This was a pattern. Two bodies of great scholars in two different places from different eras, but have one thing in common: the integrity of their bodies that are untouched by time. Sayyid Murtad, who was watching from a distance, approached the tent that night. He placed an old Arabic book on their table. On the first page was written the name of Sheikh Idris al-Kabir. He spoke in broken English. He always said, "Whoever lives with sincerity, Allah will preserve him even after the world has forgotten him." The scientists just stared at the book, not knowing what to say. A deep silence enveloped them. No data, graphs, or journals could contradict the reality they had just witnessed. In the silence of the desert night, small steps toward a new truth had begun. Not through the laboratory, but through sincerity of heart and the recognition that perhaps science does not always have the answers to everything. When the expedition returned to Europe to organize the data and plan the next visit, the atmosphere within the team changed. It was not only physical exhaustion that enveloped them, but the psychological tension caused by the clash between facts and old beliefs that were beginning to crumble. Many of them no longer viewed the discovery of the body of an Islamic scholar as merely an archaeological oddity. Too many questions remained unanswered, and all the rational answers they had believed in were slowly losing their power. In the midst of the chaos of thought, Reuben secretly did something outside the official team channel. He came from a liberal Jewish family. However, since childhood, he was familiar with the world of Catholic academia because he attended a seminary when he was a teenager. It was there that he became acquainted with many literatures and stories that were never included in general history books. Some of these stories came from the Vatican's secret library that was not accessible to just anyone. But Reuben, who had a brief internship under the guidance of a cardinal archivist at the Vatican, knew one important thing. The Vatican kept many things that it did not want the outside world to know. Through his old connections, Reuben got unofficial permission to access one of the rooms in the Vatican's apostolic archives. It was not easy and required a lot of diplomacy and a promise to maintain secrecy. He did not bring a camera or recording device, only a notebook and a pen. In the dimly lit and temperature-controlled room, among the floor-to-ceiling shelves that held thousands of old manuscripts, he found something that shook his own beliefs. A report from 1827 written in Latin, marked with a red seal indicating a high level of secrecy. The title was astonishing. De corpora non putrescentium in terra Islamica, about incorruptible bodies. In the land of Islam, Reuben read with bated breath. The report was written by a French monk who had been sent to Damascus and Cairo to investigate rumors of the bodies of Islamic scholars remaining intact centuries after their deaths. In his report, the monk recorded in detail the condition of the bodies he had found, complete with rough sketches, incorrupt bodies, a constant fragrant aroma, and even a note that the locals considered the place holy and blessed. He named 3 scholars. 2 of them matched the tombs visited by the current expedition team. To his surprise, the report concluded with a strong recommendation that the report not be published in order to maintain the stability of the Catholic faith. The monk, though driven by the spirit of scientific truth, realized the great impact this report would have if it spread widely. He advised that the document be locked and only reopened if an absolutely necessary event occurred. Reuben wrote down as much as he could. He felt his body trembling, not because of the coldness of the room, but because of the realization that what his team was unearthing was not a new phenomenon. He and his colleagues were just part of a long chain that had been hidden. Back at the inn in Rome, Reuben called Heinrich Elizabeth and 2 other team members who were beginning to show a serious interest in the spiritual side of their expedition. In the quiet of the room, he opened the notebook and began to read its contents. "Heinrich," he said quietly, "we are not the first to discover this, but perhaps we are the first to have the courage to reveal it." Heinrich listened with an unusual expression, not the face of a scientist ready to argue or debate, but of a man trying to understand the honesty of history. "If this was true," Elizabeth murmured, "then the truth had been buried for more than 2 centuries. Their discussion that night was not about theory, nor about data, but about responsibility. If this phenomenon was real and had been deliberately hidden, what should they do? Were they strong enough to bring this fact to the public? Was the world ready to accept the fact that there was something beyond the reach of science that the big institutions had tried to bury in order to maintain a single narrative? That night, under the dim lights and cool air of Rome, the decision had not been made. But one thing is for sure, they now hold a piece of a larger puzzle that they have only dared to speak of in whispers. Reuben stares at his faded copy of his notes, sweating from his hands. He knows his life will never be the same again. He is no longer just an archaeologist. He is a witness to a truth that has been hidden, and in his once doubtful heart, a question grows that can no longer be ignored. Could the light of truth have been shining from a direction he has never looked before? This chapter does not conclude. Instead, it opens a great door to a hidden past, a present that is uncertain, and a future full of moral choices. Because as they both realize there are truths too great to continue to hide, the laboratory stands majestically on the outskirts of Vienna, Austria, an international research center that is usually used for forensic research at the request of Interpol and the World Heritage Institute. Complete with 3D scanning technology, mass spectrometry, and stable isotope testing chambers that only a few countries in the world have. This is where, for the first time, the bodies of clerics found intact will be scientifically tested using the most modern methods. Permission from local authorities is not easy to obtain. It took the intervention of the Middle East Heritage Authority and the embassy to ensure that the body was moved with strict and respectful procedures. Even before the body was placed in a special freezer, a short prayer ceremony was performed by a local imam. Scientists, despite their secular backgrounds, began to bow their heads in silence when the name of Allah was mentioned. In the laboratory, the first body to be tested was that of Sheikh Idris al-Kabir. He was estimated to be more than 800 years old. He was placed in a sterile observation room, scanned using the high-resolution CT scan. The results immediately caused a small commotion in the analysis room. "No soft tissue damage," muttered Dr. Franz Rieder, a senior forensic pathologist. This didn't make sense. It shouldn't be possible. Normally, human tissue would begin to decompose within days of death. Even in dry soil and without oxygen, the chemical decomposition process would still occur. But the sheikh's muscle tissue, skin, and even hair appeared intact. There was no sign of natural mummification as is usually found in Egyptian mummies. No shrinkage, no extreme discoloration. The team then took small tissue samples from his arms and abdomen. The samples were tested using spectrometry to detect the presence of preservative chemicals, formaldehyde, resins, or natural antibacterial agents. The results were zero. There were no compounds that would indicate the body had ever been preserved. "This is not the result of human intervention," said Dr. Eva Morgenstern, an organic chemist. "There are no artificial compounds left behind. This is a natural body, but intact as if it had just died last night." The next step is microbiome analysis, mapping the bacteria that are in the human body after death. Normally, after someone dies, millions of bacteria in the body will start to decompose the tissue. However, in the body of Sheikh Idris, almost no colonies of decomposing bacteria were found. Even more astonishing, soil samples from the grave showed the presence of active microorganisms that should accelerate decomposition. The provisional conclusion is that the body of Sheikh Idris should have decomposed like other bodies, but it did not. They tried to repeat the analysis on the bodies of other clerics found in the Middle East. The results were similar. The structure of the internal organs was mostly still recognizable. The skin did not suffer major damage. Even the texture of the clothes remained elastic. All scientific parameters could not find a definite answer. In the middle of the night, when the scientists sat staring at the screen of test results, the atmosphere turned heavy. No one else spoke of anomalies, outliers, or coincidences. Those words were no longer enough. Even Dr. Heinrich, known as the most vocal skeptic on the team, sat silently, staring blankly at the monitor seemed to witness something that slowly shook the foundations of his logic. "This is not a case of biology," he said finally. "This is not a matter of preservation techniques. We are witnessing a form of intervention." Out of nowhere, someone from the team who had always maintained a calm demeanor said quietly, "Maybe it's not about the body, but about who owned it during life, about their life and for whom they lived." The sentence hung in the air, penetrating the walls of the laboratory full of cold equipment and the sound of machinery. No one denied it, because secretly they were all beginning to realize that their scientific process had taken them to an unexpected place. A space that cannot be explained with data, but only with the sincerity to admit that there is something greater than human knowledge. That night, the test results were collected, compiled into a secret report, and stored on an encrypted server. But that was not the most memorable thing. What was embedded in the minds of each team member was a question that began to bother their hearts one by one. Is this a sign that God really takes care of those who sincerely live their lives on His path? This chapter did not end with euphoria or applause for a great discovery. Instead, it ended with a long silence, like someone who had just heard the truth for the first time and did not know where to start to understand it. In a simple hotel meeting room in the heart of Granada, the scientists who were part of the expedition team sat in a circle in silence. After a series of astonishing findings in the laboratory, the expedition stopped for a moment, not because of a lack of funds or permits, but because of something more complicated, anxiety within each of them. Reuben sat back in his chair. His eyes stared blankly at the wall. Elizabeth stared at her field notes while biting her lower lip. Heinrich, who usually loudly voiced rational views, was this time more silent. There was no more talk about test equipment, forensic methods, or measurement results. What was left was a question that could not be answered with numbers or graphs. "If this is not a miracle," Elizabeth said quietly, "then what is?" No one answered immediately. The word miracle was not a term they used in the academic realm. It was too vague, too subjective. But wasn't science itself at the edge of its capabilities? Hadn't their findings not already pushed the limits of what they had always considered absolute? Heinrich finally spoke up. "I don't deny the facts. The bodies are intact. There were no preservatives, no mummification techniques. But does that mean God is giving us a sign? Or is this just something we can't explain yet?" "Not yet. If it were just one body, we might have considered it a coincidence," Reuben interrupted. "But we are talking about several bodies in different locations, spanning hundreds of years, and all of them are Islamic figures. It's not just a pattern, it's consistency." "I know," Henri said quietly, "and that's what scared me." He stood up, walked to the window, looked out. The afternoon sunlight seeped through the glass, illuminating the fine dust that danced in the air. "I grew up believing that everything could be explained, that nature worked with definite laws, that there was no room for fate or miracles. But now I feel like a child who just found out that the world is wider than the map he studied." "It's not about throwing away reason," Elizabeth replied in a calm tone, "but about accepting that our reason has limits." Their discussion deepened from science to philosophy, from logic to existence. That night, the meeting table turned into a field of searching for meaning. Some talked about moral relativism, about how truth could only be a perspective. But there were also those who began to dare to mention the name of God, although still hesitantly. Reuben opened the notes he had made while at the Vatican. He pointed to a paragraph. "When science cannot explain, it doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist. Maybe it's just not the time for humans to see it." Those words were written almost 2 centuries ago by a monk who is now unknown to anyone. But that night, the words felt like echoes from the future, not the past. Heinrich sat back and stared at his friends. "Do you think that we are being led to something?" No one answered directly, but from the way they looked at each other, it was clear that the question had been lingering in their hearts for a long time. Over the next few days, the atmosphere of the team changed. Some of them began to read Islamic literature diligently. Elizabeth was seen holding an English translation of the Quran. Reuben occasionally discussed with the local imam the concept of the soul and the afterlife. Even the most stubborn Heinrich began to open up to the possibility that maybe the truth did not always come in the form he understood. But in the midst of this search, there was also fear. Fear of losing their old identities. Fear that accepting something they had always rejected could change everything. Careers, social relationships, even intellectual self-esteem. "If we accept this as a sign from God," Elizabeth said one night, "what should we do next?" It was a lingering question, more terrifying than the most shocking forensic test results. Because therein lies the real dilemma. Not how to accept the facts, but how to change your life after accepting the truth. And it was at this point that the gap between reason and faith widened. They stood on the edge of the abyss, not knowing whether to jump or stay on the side of comfort. But one thing was for sure, after all they had seen, felt, and researched, there was no going back to being the same people they had been before the expedition began. That afternoon, a gentle breeze blew through the courtyard of an old mosque in Damascus. The sun was leaning west, coloring the sky with a calming orange glow. The team of scientists who had been living in Syria for several weeks for research sat in a small circle on the mosque's terrace. In front of them sat a young man in a simple white robe and a thin turban on his head. His face was calm, his eyes sharp but calm. His name was Sheikh Yusuf, a young cleric known among local Islamic academics for his rational and dialogical approach. Elizabeth, who had been the team's liaison with the local community from the start, introduced him as a bridge between faith and reason. The scientists, who had previously been accustomed to talking to archaeologists or conservative imams who only gave quotes without context, now felt that this was the moment they had been waiting for. "So you have seen bodies that do not rot?" asked Sheikh Yusuf after hearing the summary of their research. Heinrich nodded. Even one of them was more than 8 centuries old. No formalin, no mummification techniques, but still intact and even smelled good. Sheikh Yusuf smiled slightly. That is not new in our tradition. Islam does not make the bodies of saints or scholars as objects of worship, but this phenomenon is recorded in many narrations, not to be worshipped, but to be contemplated. Reuben leaned forward curiously. How you explain this from the perspective of your religious teachings? Sheikh Yusuf opened a small page of the Quran in front of him. Allah said in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 154, "And do not say of those who are killed in the way of Allah that they are dead. In fact, they are alive, but you do not realize it." He looked at them one by one. This verse is not just a metaphor. Some scholars of interpretation say that martyrs and saints have a special status. Even their bodies are guarded as part of that glory. "But why only them?" asked Elizabeth. "We also tested the graves of several religious figures from other faiths, even highly respected ones, but none of them had intact bodies." Sheikh Yusuf nodded slowly. Islam places great emphasis on pure monotheism and sincere deeds. When someone lives entirely for Allah without worldly desires, even his preaching, his knowledge, his struggles are solely for Allah, then Allah is the one who guards his honor, even after death. But this is not a guarantee for all Muslims, only for those who are truly clean and honest in their lives. Heinrich sighed. But that does not answer from a scientific perspective. We cannot record because of Allah in our journal reports. Sheikh Yusuf laughed lightly. And that is the limit that you have been avoiding all this time. You want everything to be formulated, to be measured, to be retested. But life is not always like a laboratory. You must learn to accept that there is a reality beyond the reach of your testing equipment. Reuben chimed in. So, you believe that science is not enough? Science is a blessing from Allah. But like all blessings, it has limits, Sheikh Yusuf replied. Science can dissect the human body but cannot explain love. Science can calculate the age of a body, but it cannot explain why it is not destroyed. Because therein lies the wisdom to remind humans that science is not God. It is only a tool to know God. The conversation flowed warmly for more than 2 hours. Sheikh Yusuf did not preach, but answered calmly and logically. He discussed verses of the Quran, but also related them to the principles of modern science about soil, climate, metabolism, even molecules. But in the end, he always returned to one point, that science can only explain how, but religion answers why. When the call to prayer for Maghrib sounded, the atmosphere became silent. The wind carried the echo of the muezzin's voice throughout the city. Sheikh Yusuf excused himself to pray, and the scientists looked at each other. No one spoke, but their faces showed something that had changed. Not because of the argument, but because of the clarity and sincerity that they had just witnessed. That night in their simple lodging, Reuben wrote his personal notes. Today I met someone who did not deny science, but made me realize that logic is not enough to explain the world. I began to understand why people can believe without seeing, because sometimes seeing isn't enough to believe. There was no declaration of faith that night. There was no shahada or emotional hugs, but their hearts were cracking little by little. Not by debate, but by the truth that touches silently, and it is stronger than anything. Night enveloped a small town on the Syrian border with a softness that only a restless heart can feel. The desert wind flowed slowly through the windows of the old inn where the team stopped during their expedition. There was no sound except the ticking of the clock and the occasional gentle breeze shaking the curtains. But behind the silence, there was something boiling in the chest of each of them. For weeks they had been researching, digging, testing, and measuring. From tomb to tomb, from laboratory to laboratory, and from old books to the Vatican manuscript that they found by accident. All the data, all the evidence, and all the realities they had collected. However, now that the scientific task had been completed, they felt empty, as if the science that had been their lantern was no longer enough to illuminate the darkness of deeper questions. What did all this mean? Reuben woke up first that night. Cold sweat soaked his forehead. Even though the air was not hot, He had just had a dream. In her dream, she walked in a vast and silent desert. She was thirsty, her steps were tired, but she kept walking. In the distance, she saw a figure in a white robe sitting under a tree. When Reuben approached, the figure smiled and said softly, "Seek the truth honestly, not arrogantly." Then the figure disappeared, leaving her with a sense of peace she had never felt before. A few minutes later, Elizabeth woke up. Her eyes were swollen and her chest was tight with an inexplicable feeling. In her dream, she heard the chanting of a verse that she did not understand, but was able to touch something very deep. The voice was not loud, but it penetrated her and made her cry without knowing why. She opened her laptop, searched for the translation of the Quran, tried to remember one piece of words that she managed to catch, Nur Kahaya. She found the verse in Surah An-Nur, verse 35. Her tears fell heavily as she read it, as if something had knocked on the door of her most hidden heart. Heinrich, the team leader, who had seemed the most skeptical all this time, was also awake. He did not speak, just sat pensive on his bed. In his hand was a small note, not a scientific journal, but his personal writing since they arrived. He wrote one sentence that night: "If all things that cannot be explained by science are considered non-existent, then this life is just the arrogance of reason." His dream was also sad. He saw himself standing in front of the grave of a scholar, but this time the scholar opened his eyes and said, "What is alive is not the body, but the truth." Without each other realizing, they all went down to the dark courtyard of the inn. The sky stretched wide, full of stars like black cloth sprinkled with diamonds. They stared at each other as if they knew that each had gone through the same inner experience. No one spoke first, just silence, stillness. But precisely in that silence, the most sacred words came out of Reuben's mouth slowly, almost like a whisper. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." Elizabeth repeated it with a trembling voice. Then Heinrich, although he had been silent for a long time, looked at the sky and said it firmly, "Ahawa wahadu ana Muhammadana." The three of them looked at each other. There was no hug, no excessive tears. There was only calm, like a river that was previously murky, now clear again. In a silent night in a country far from their homeland, they had found what had so far been inexplicable by any laboratory. In the morning, they prayed the dawn prayer in a small mosque that they had previously only passed every day without paying attention. The old imam greeted them gently, as if he already knew everything without needing to be explained. In their first prostration, tears flowed uncontrollably, not because they were sad, but because for the first time they felt truly alive. They came as scientists, returning as servants. And between those 2 points, they found the truth that knowledge is the path, but guidance is the goal. And both, if honestly sought, will bring anyone to a meeting point with God. Several months had passed since that silent night on the Syrian border, when Reuben, Elizabeth, and Heinrich declared their faith in a whisper that shook their souls. They returned to Europe not as the same scientists. Their status in the academic world remains high. Professorships, scientific publications, and international networks still surround their names. But in their chests, a new light grows, the light of faith. Reuben is no longer busy with just numbers, data, and graphs. She began compiling a new journal that not only wrote the results of biological research on the bodies of scholars, but also reflected the limitations of science in answering spiritual phenomena. She dared to write that there is a dimension that cannot be explained by any microscope or laboratory, the dimension of faith. Elizabeth interacted more with the student community. She held interdisciplinary discussions at the university. Her teaching place opened up space for dialogue between science and religion, which had previously been considered contradictory. She told stories about her experiences, dreams, verses that touched her soul, and the peace she felt after reciting the Shahada. In every forum, she emphasized one thing: we do not lose logic when we believe. In fact, we find a more complete logic. Heinrich, who was known to be tough and skeptical, is now the most straightforward spokesperson in conveying the truth he found. He wrote a book entitled Beyond the Fleas, Science Meets Faith, which rocked the scientific community. In her book, she analyzed forensic data on the bodies of scholars that had been intact for centuries, along with a rejection of natural preservation theories. However, the last chapter of her book was a chapter she never imagined she would write. The chapter on prostration, about how a scientist finally prostrated himself not because he was defeated by logic, but because he found the true truth through honest logic. Their journey is no longer a journey of discovery, but a journey of delivery. They visit various countries, attend scientific conferences, and also have dialogues with religious and scientific figures. They do not force anyone to follow their path, but they open up space for anyone to see that faith is not the enemy of science, that the intact bodies of the saints are not only biological phenomena, but also a sign of Allah's love for His sincere servants. In the midst of their busy lives, they never forget the first place that changed their lives. A year after the expedition ended, they returned to Syria, to the small mosque where they first prayed dawn together as Muslims. They met again with the old imam who had welcomed them without asking many questions. The imam smiled when he saw them coming. "You're back," he said softly. "We never really left, Sheikh," Reuben replied. Under the reddish afternoon sky, they sat together. Not much was said. The desert wind flowed slowly as before. Their hearts were calm, like water that had found its estuary. In their hearts, they knew that this journey would not be easy. The academic world was still full of skepticism. Many colleagues considered them to have abandoned rationality, but they did not waver because they knew that knowledge was the ladder that led them to faith, and now they wanted to be the ladder for others. On their desks were rows of Qurans, scientific journals, and personal notes, all side by side. There was no conflict, because now they understood that truth is not something that stands on one side. It is a bridge that connects reason and heart, between fact and meaning, between this world and the hereafter. They had changed, but the change was not a release of identity, but rather a refinement. From scientists seeking evidence to servants who convey light, from lovers of logic to bearers of trust, and from seekers of truth to witnesses of the truth. Their journey did not end at the grave, nor in the laboratory. Their journey continued through writing, preaching, dialogue, and exemplary behavior. Because in the light of Islam, they found that knowledge never stops. It continues to run as faith continues to live. In their chests is now written one thing for sure. There is no contradiction between knowledge and faith if both are used to seek the true truth. Friends of the Islam